Welcome to Side of Science.
With Stacey and Clinton, because every story has a side of science. And this one's bloody interesting.
On today's episode, we are talking good humour, bad blood, blood hacks, and answering the question, how does blood do its job?
Clinton, you're in good humour today.
Always. It's a Wednesday, it's sunny outside, we're always in good humour.
Do you know where the term humour comes from?
I do, only because we have been researching this the past week or so and discovering that it actually comes from the Greek word chemos, which means juice. But the humour concept itself is much broader than that and relates to essentially blood.
Yeah. So I thought this was interesting too because it comes from like the four humours, so blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, all the good stuff.
Right. We're not in good humour anymore.
No, I've ruined that for you. Sorry. But they thought that if you had, I guess, balanced blood or a lot of blood, then you were said to be in good humour if you're optimistic. And if you were in bad form or bad humour, then they would do all these practices to try and balance the fluids or the humours. So things like bloodletting to drain blood, thinking it would balance, induce vomiting, laxatives, or prescribing like cold or wet foods in order to cool.
Wet foods, like wet cabbage.
I think more like cucumbers or sour drinks and things, considering cooling or to counteract hotness of yellow bile, so to speak. So I can't imagine what I would have been prescribed back in the day, but I thought that was really interesting.
It also gives rise to the term bad blood, as in we use that now for, disagreement between people, but really that concept of like bad humour, bad combination, like you said, the opposite of good humour. And of course, now we have a Taylor Swift song for bad blood.
She loves her science.
So we've been triggered to take this slightly bloody path based on the fact that there was news over the past few weeks of scientists discovering a new blood system, MAL, which we won't go into in detail today, but it has just got us started to wondering about how does blood work? How does it do its job? But before we can even answer that, Stacey, I think we need to talk about what is the role of blood?
Yeah.
What is it meant to do?
Well, it's meant to transport. So it's a transport system, carries oxygen from the lungs, carbon dioxide from tissues to lungs, carries the nutrients from digestion. So whatever you eat will end up in your blood system. It carries hormones around your body and also removes wastes. Then there's the regulation side of it, so maintaining body temperature by distributing heat, helps keep pH balance. And then protection, so your white blood cells, they fight infections, and platelets will help clotting. And then there's the communication, so carrying those hormones that I mentioned as well.
It's doing a lot.
It's busy, yeah, lots to do. And I guess it has a lot of help in the sense that blood is a connective tissue, so it is a fluid, but it is actually considered a tissue in biology because it has lots of different cells contributing to its functions. And so those things are plasma, which is the straw-coloured liquid, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets.
And as I read, it's red blood cells that are obviously make up most of the blood. They're by far the largest, and that's obviously why we have the red colour, because they're carrying the iron and the haemoglobin that gives it that colour. Yeah,
so about 50 to 60% of blood is the pale yellow fluid that the red blood cells are suspended in. But yes, the red blood cells provide the colour. And what's interesting too is that they have this kind of biconcave shape. And so they're tiny flexible discs. As they get older, they throw out the nucleus and they contain heme group. So a heme group is iron containing, and each one can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. And so the oxygen will bind to the red blood cells and carry them through the body.
And that shape, that kind of squished donut shape without the hole in the middle though, is really important, as I read, because it is what allows it to change shape and then particularly to fit into capillaries that are far smaller than the red blood cell itself. So it's able to kind of squeeze through these tiny little spaces to then oxygenate and transport, as you said, across the body.
Yeah, so it increases the surface area and allows it to be flexible and to sort of turn corners and travel the highways of the veins and arteries. Yeah.
And that surface area is particularly important because then that's maximising the amount of oxygen that it can carry, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think, a little bit of a kind of model to work with here for the blood. So we've got, as you've described to me, we've got red blood cells, white blood cells, plasma, and
platelets.
They're the 4 parts.
Yeah.
What sort of like makeup of those is in our blood, in healthy blood?
Yeah, okay. So majority of it is going to be the plasma. So if we think of cereal, you could have your milk would be the plasma, the fluid that all these cells are suspended in. Your red blood cells would be your Cheerios, yeah?
Yeah, or Fruit Loops or something. Yeah. We'll go with a round-shaped cereal to help the analogy, yep.
I don't know many cereals, but yeah.
I know a fair few. It's definitely not muesli. And it's not Wheat Bix.
Okay, that's good. All right, so we've got our red blood cells, so that would make up the rest of it. In fact, an adult has about 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells, and you're creating them. They don't live forever. They live about 90 days, and then your body will be creating new red blood cells to replace the old ones all the time.
So as I understand it, the plasma's sitting at about 55 to 60% of the total volume of blood.
Yep.
90% of that is water.
Yep.
So the milk is a good analogy. We're thinking of something very kind of fluid here. Then we're looking at the red blood cells at about 40 to 45%.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're left with white blood cells.
Yeah. So these are far fewer in number than red blood cells, but they're really critical. So I don't know, maybe they're the banana on top.
Yeah,
I think a few slices of banana.
I think their total sits at about 1%. So we're really up to the top. So it's like, I'm on a diet. It's a piece of banana.
Yeah. And finally, platelets. So these are tiny cell fragments that are broken off pieces of huge bone marrow cells, and they act as responders when you cut yourself. So they plug the gaps. So they'll stop you from bleeding out, essentially. But a lot less of them. So I don't know, what could you sprinkle on top of your banana?
Well, I've given up on the diet since I've sliced a bit of banana. So I'm just going to put some sugar on top of my Cheerios and banana.
No wonder you're in good humour today.
I'm sitting at, that's kind of the one that's less than 1%, really. It's that tiny little bit on top. So then just to recap in terms of the question I asked, what is the job that blood does? As I'm hearing from you, it's transportation, regulation, protection, and communication.
Exactly. And I said, it's connective tissue. We can remember that because it connects all parts of the body by circulating and delivering nutrients. And it makes up about 8% of your body weight.
Forget that diet.
Yeah, the bloodletting. There's your new diet.
Okay, Stacey. So if that is the job of blood, transportation, regulation, protection, communication, that blend of cereal now that we've created in our minds is running through our veins and our capillaries and all through our bodies. But it now needs to get into, as I understand, the cells in the body to do that job. We're not just a big walking ball of liquid.
No, we're not water balloons.
We're not water balloons. So how's it making that transference? How is it moving through our body?
Yeah, okay. So this is quite cool because if you think about it, so all of the blood is contained in veins, arteries, and capillaries. And so the capillaries are the network which goes out throughout all the cells in your body. And so these have tiny holes. They're called fenestrations. I like that word. But the tiny little gaps. Those gaps can actually get bigger, and that's what can lead to inflammation as well, because that actually allows some of the fluid to seep out. Now, we don't want our red blood cells to seep out. That's bad news. But some of the fluid that has all of the dissolved nutrients that you have from eating your bowl of cereal, you need to get that sugar into your cells, your body cells. And so that has to get out of the capillaries and then to the cell. And so what happens is the blood flows through these capillaries and a bit of the plasma leaks out through the thin capillary walls. And this is on purpose, so it can move through. And it's done through creating hydrostatic pressure. So if the heart is a pump, and it will force all of that blood through the arteries and then finally into the capillaries, then that force actually squeezes some of that plasma out, and that plasma contains the glucose and the oxygen that will bathe the cells that are surrounding by, and they'll be able to take up all of that good stuff. Then, now you've got some of that squeezed out. Inside the hose, the vessel, the vein, you've still got all of your large proteins that can't fit out, your red blood cells, but a bit less water. So that it doesn't have as much pressure anymore because that's forced it out. You still with me?
Yep, following.
So that's all gone. So how does the fluid then get back into the blood? I know that's what you were thinking.
Yeah.
So what happens is because you've still got large proteins inside the blood, it actually works through oncotic pressure, which is basically where the proteins will draw fluid back into the vein and continue going on. So the proteins are what draws that back in. It's like a concentration gradient. The water actually wants to dissolve, go to the area where there's kind of salts and proteins. So it's constantly moving back and forth. What's also interesting is once that liquid, the same liquid that's in the blood vessel, we call it plasma. As soon as it's outside of a blood vessel, we call it tissue fluid. And so that's pretty much why all your bones are wet, which is a kind of weird thing to think about. But
it's kind of gross. So I am kind of like a walking water balloon.
It could be worse. And sometimes after a flight, you might be. And so the reason for that is because that tissue fluid, some of it will come back into the veins, but some of it will actually turn into lymph. And so lymph is a bit special because we have lymphatic vessels that are one-way channels, and they carry fluid away from the tissues. So they collect the lymph from throughout the body and eventually dump it back into the blood circulation, but in your lower neck. And so in this way, the fluid that leaked out is returned after it does all the rounds, and this prevents swelling. But the lymph is actually returned, you know how we have the heart to pump blood through the vessels? The lymph is actually returned through muscles, through movement. So if you're sitting on a plane for a really long time and you're not walking around, then that lymph doesn't actually get back up to, just below your neck. And so you'll get what's known as swelling or edema from that sitting fluid.
Which is why those kind of pressure stockings and that I imagine are meant to help that, like you're saying, it creates that pressure, it creates that movement and stops it kind of sitting stationary.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so to just recircle on what we've just talked about, if I can, in terms of the blood and what's happening here, we have the heart pumping, it's creating pressure through the arteries, veins, capillaries, pushing the blood through, the blood's travelling through the body. The plasma then transfers out of the veins and capillaries into the cells, into the body. There it becomes tissue fluid. The cells of the body are covered in that. They take in the nutrients and various things, and then some of that goes back into the capillaries and veins to continue its journey, and then some of it starts to go into the lymph. Yeah,
so the lymphatic capillaries collect that fluid that leaks that into surrounding tissues. So once it's into the lymphatic system, it's now called lymph, and it may contain pathogens, so things that are like bacteria that can cause illness, waste or damaged cells. And it usually also carries fat as well. So digested in the small intestine, sometimes the fats are too big to be carried in the blood, so they actually get carried in the lymph.
Mine's definitely too big.
And so from there, it travels into the lymph nodes. So you've got lymph nodes all through your body, and they act as checkpoints, and they'll filter the lymph and destroy those possible bacteria and nasties. And then the lymph can then drain back into the bloodstream at the bottom of your neck.
A system all working together.
Yeah, it's kind of like irrigation. So the heart is the pump for the blood. It pushes it around. The arteries are the pipes, so they carry the oxygen-rich water. So I always remember it as A arteries, A away from the heart. So that's the direction. Capillaries are your sprinklers, so they kind of leak the nutrients and the oxygen and hormones into the tissues. Then you've got your veins, which is where we're going to dump all of the deoxygenated blood and bring that fluid back and come back to the heart. And then your leftover kind of drainage is the lymphatic system.
It's a good summary. And the veins, just to clarify there, that are taking back that blood, is that why we've got like essentially blue-coloured veins? Is that the coloration that we're seeing the difference with?
So it's interesting. When heme, which is the iron-containing group in the red blood cell, binds to oxygen, we call it oxyhemoglobin, and at that point you can see a transformation to this bright red colour. It's really bright. And then when the oxygen's left and the heme's on its own, it's kind of like a dark kind of purple red colour. It's never actually blue. It's only because of the way that the light filters through the skin that our veins look blue from outside the body.
And of course, we did an episode on colour a couple of weeks ago.
A good episode.
A good episode. I think it was episode 4. So if people are interested in like how colour changes with light, definitely go back and listen to that one.
Yeah.
We have, I think, Stacey, now covered, maybe record time for us, the question that we set out to answer, which is how does blood do its job? And in doing that, we also have to obviously look at what is the role of blood and what makes blood itself. But of course, we haven't talked now at all about what happens when we want to hack that as humans and make our blood kind of work more for us.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. So you can hack this because I guess red blood cells, their job is to transfer oxygen. Oxygen needs to get to the cells because the cells use it to produce energy. And so if you're an athlete, then you want to have a lot of oxygen delivered to those cells really efficiently so that you can make that energy and increase your endurance and whatnot.
We all know what happens when you can't get the oxygen to the body. You're short of breath and you can't keep up, right? Like that's
lactic acid builds up. You get, it's not good.
It's me playing tennis.
So if, for example, I think, well, naturally anyway, the kidneys will release a hormone, erythropoietin, and that stimulates red blood cell production. So it'll be stimulated if, for example, heaven forbid, you had an accident, you lost a lot of blood, or if you were short of breath for a really long time, your body thought you were suffocating. So at high altitudes, for example, if there's low oxygen concentration, your body will naturally release this EPO, and that will drive the body to create more red blood cells. So a lot of training camps for athletes will be at high altitude to kind of hack this and get a bit of an edge. And then there's the synthetic EPO. So this was used by cyclists to increase their hematocrit. Now, the hematocrit, this is kind of like what we were talking about before with the cereal. So it is the percent of blood that is made up of red blood cells. Now, normal male hematocrit is roughly 40 to 55% red blood cells.
Which was our cereal in the milk.
Yeah. And so females, it's 36 to 48%.
Slightly lower.
Yeah, quite a bit lower. But blood doping can push this to 55%. Now, it's going to be a lot harder for those red blood cells to actually move through the body. It thickens the blood like it would with the cereal, right?
We know what happens when you put too much cereal in the milk. It almost forms a solid.
Yeah. So I was reading that athletes who sort of inject EPO, particularly, Lance Armstrong had admitted to this, and cyclists at that time, they needed to be woken up in the middle of the night to sort of get up, to get moving, to get their blood moving around because it was so thick that they gave themselves high potential of having a stroke or a heart attack.
What a frightening thought that your blood is so kind of thick and syrupy that you're having to move just to kind of stop it basically solidifying in your body.
Yeah. The things you'll do for a yellow jersey, huh? So the athletes withdraw their own blood weeks before a race. They store it and then they inject it with EPO, and then they'll reinfuse it before competition to kind of boost this up. And they have to do it with their own blood because otherwise there's a chance of rejection. So also it made it kind of less easy to detect too.
In terms of drug testing and doping tests.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess what else is interesting about this is that there are examples of or situations where this has kind of happened naturally. So Sherpas and high altitude adaptation. So if we think that in the Himalayas, they're going to be at obviously much higher altitudes. So the air is so thin. So most people who go to altitude have to acclimatise by making more red blood cells. So the EPO goes up. But Sherpas, however, through long-term evolutionary adaptation, they have developed a different strategy. So they tend to have lower hemoglobin levels at altitude than lowlanders would. And that's kind of counterintuitive because if they have lower hemoglobin, they would have fewer red blood cells, so low oxygen. But it turns out that keeping the blood thinner, so less viscous, helps it flow faster and reach tissues more easily. So too many red blood cells, like I said, can thicken the heart and cause those problems. So they've avoided that through having kind of lower red blood cells, lower hemoglobin levels.
So rather than trying to add the oxygen in with the hemoglobin, it's just thinner, which, as you kind of point out, is kind of counterintuitive. But by doing that, it can move faster through the body and reach the tissues and organs it needs to.
Yeah, they also have high levels of nitric oxide, which vasodilates, so it causes the blood vessels to get wider. And again, that helps with better blood flow. So whilst they don't have more, it's flowing more freely, and so it's delivering oxygen still really efficiently.
A case of not more is better, but just more effective is better.
Yeah, they breathe faster too, have larger lung capacities, so that contributes to getting the oxygen in and efficient and moving around the body. So, yeah, interesting. And then the different sort of superhuman, the Andeans from the Andes Mountains in South America, they historically adapt by producing more red blood cells, whereas, the Tibetans did the opposite. And so this is a great example of how plastic and adaptable our blood system is.
I do have, Stacey, one more fun fact to round out our episode on blood.
Oh, goody.
Which is around the scent of blood, which is quite specific, as you probably know, like if you've ever had the joy of smelling blood. Sounds like a great Oscar-winning movie. There is a chemical in blood, E2D, that is responsible for that very specific kind of quite like metallic smell. It also gives blood its kind of slightly metallic colour. That chemical, humans are extremely sensitive to the smell of it. Like, we can apparently detect it in very small amounts. But I think what's super interesting about it is that it actually triggers an investigative behaviour in predators like Siberian tigers and African hunting dogs and wolves, and avoidance behaviours in traditional kind of prey like mice and some types of flies, and humans as well, which is why I think we're so good at detecting it.
That's so interesting that it's cross-species. Yeah. And so this is all animal blood that, right.
And it's apparently, as I read, it's a result of the oxidation of the lipids in the blood as they are exposed to the air. So imagine a kind of carcass ripped open or dying, and it's going to trigger those animal instincts. Right.
Well, I can't say I've had a moment where I've, been whacked in the face with the scent of blood, but I'm interested.
Wait for it.
Yeah. Is that a threat?
Okay, let's round this out with bringing it back to the curriculum in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Year 8 cells, Year 8 systems, body systems, I think Year 9 homeostasis, evolution as well, the different ways that humans have adapted in different environments to low altitudes. And I think ethics maybe too of the blood doping around that.
I think that would be a really great entry point as well. I could imagine that particularly for like Year 9s and 10s maybe looking at doping in sport, like it's often in the news, looking at high performance, particularly, in Australia and things like football and things like that. Like I imagine that would spark a lot of students' interest potentially and provide an entry point into looking at blood and then the systems of blood and some of the more interesting parts of it. Yeah,
definitely. You could also turn our little cereal concoction and make a model of blood and then separating mixtures in Year 7? Yeah. With the centrifuging, blood is often used as an example of that. And I'm not sure if I mentioned that sort of yellow plasma that sort of, it separates out by density. So you get that, what they call a Buffy coat on top, which is that yellow colour from buff, the Old English word for yellow.
I wonder if that's where Buffy the Vampire Slayer came from. I wonder, because it's got a nice little vampire.
Because she's blonde.
And there's a vampire link.
And the blood, yeah.
Could be.
Could be.
I think you mentioned earlier that you had done a prac where you looked at the kind of the makeup of blood, right? Is that?
Yeah, so similar to our cereal concoction, but water, and then you can dye like Cheerios with red, and then or even a straw-coloured liquid if you put some yellow food dye and some water, add some dyed red Cheerios. You'll notice that when you put those in there, it'll take over a red colour, some marshmallows for the white blood cells, and then just some, I don't know, whatever you want to do for platelets. You only need a few of them. But put that in a water bottle and there's your model.
And there's your lunch.
Yeah, well,
at the end of class. It sounds like fun. I've had fun talking about blood.
Yeah, bloody good time. Thank you.